In this tutorial, I'm going to talk about using the names functionality to name cells and ranges in Excel. This functionality can be found under the Formulas tab under the Define Names group. So why do we use names? Well, the main reason is that names allow us to parse through formulas in a more intuitive way. And so whether you're familiar with nested if statements, I would argue that this second formula is much easier to interpret than the one that uses the cell references. And so the second one says if the sales are greater than the threshold 2, give the higher bonus rate. Otherwise, if the sales is just greater than the first threshold, then apply the lowest bonus rate. Otherwise, give a bonus of 0. Okay. The second reason why we use cell names is because it allows us to navigate through workbooks in an easier way, and I'll show you that later. So there are many ways in which we can define names, and the easiest one is by using the name box. Okay, and I'm going to show you how to do this in a simple example, and I'll talk about kind of the naming convention that we use to name cells, as well as what it means for us to have a global scope when we define a name. Then in order to make use of the structure and of the headers that exist in a workbook, we can use the Create from Selection option that is in the Define Names group to allow Excel to automatically pull in names from the headers and apply them to the cells with the values that we want to then use in other formulas. The next thing I'll do is I'll talk to you about how to name a range of cells as opposed to an individual cell, and how this is useful in terms of copying and pasting formulas that kind of run a set of columns or rows. Sometimes when we define a name, we want it to only be known to the local worksheet. We don't want it to apply, we don't want it to be visible to other formulas in the workbook that are in other worksheets. And so to do that, we have to change the scope of the name so that it's defined locally. And to do that, we use the define name functionality in the define names group. I'll then talk about how to use the name manager both to create, to edit, and to delete names, and I'll discuss what happens if you delete a name that now has been used within a worksheet. Okay, and I will wrap up by talking about how do we use names to navigate within a workbook. So for all of the examples that I'm going to use, I'm going to rely on this very simple example where we have salespeople with who have a particular given sales amount, and I want to calculate the bonus for each salesperson based on a bonus rate of 10%. Okay, so let me quickly go to the worksheet, and one of the things that I could do here is I could just say the bonus is equal to the sales amount times the bonus rate. Clearly I would have to use an absolute cell reference here, but this would give me the bonus rate. Okay, but rather than just doing this, I want to create a name that's going to allow us to make this formula more readable. So let me go back to here and show you how I would do this. So the first thing I have to do is I want to define cell C3 to be known as the bonus rate. And so to do that, I have to first click on cell C3, and notice that I don't want to click on the label that is already there, right, in cell B3. I actually want to define cell C3, so I click on it, and then I click on the name bar and I type bonus rate and I press enter. And then this is now rather than having to refer to cell C3 using the label C3, I will be able to refer to that cell as bonus rate, and that's going to be a reference that kind of is similar to having an absolute reference. And we'll talk about that in class later, but let me do this so that you can see. So here I'm going to come to C3, click on it, go to the name box, and type in bonus rate. Now notice that I put in on purpose a space in between the two, and when I press enter, I'm going to get an error message from Excel that's saying, you know, this is not a valid name. So I say okay, and so there are two things that I can do here. I can either type bonus rate without a space, or I can use Excel's convention to put an underscore every time I would have a space, and so then I press enter. Okay, so now if I come to cell D6 and I say the bonus is going to be the sales amount for salesman A times the C3, now it says that's the bonus rate. Okay, and if I drag this once, I see that I continue to point to the bonus rate in my formula. Now, what does it mean for this to be a global, having a global scope? So if I come here and I say bonus rate, okay, times 3, it recognizes the value of what I'm referring to, the cell, and multiplies it by 3. But it's global because I can go to another worksheet and type in bonus rate. And by the way, every time the defined names appear with a little name label next to them, and to access it, I can either press tab and then enter, or once I begin to see the name, I can double click on the label and then press enter. Okay, and so that's how I get. But this using the name box gives me a global scope. I can see it in any worksheet in the workbook. So now the second thing that I want to talk about is how to use the create from selection option. And so this relies on the structure of the data to suggest names. Okay, so let's go ahead and do this, and I will show you here. So supposing I wanted, so here, if I wanted to name the salespersons now, here I would have to come in here and type salesman C and then enter, and then come here and then go to the name box and type salesman D and enter. But there's an easier way to do this. I can select both the value, the cell with the values, and with the headers that I want, and I can come to the formula tab and say create from selection. Okay, and what Excel does is it says, okay, I see that the labels that are here are the ones that are on the left column, and I say yes. Okay, and so now when I come here, I see salesman C times bonus rate. Okay, but there's a slight problem with this, okay, which is this. Once I define it, the names, if I copy it, right, this uses an absolute reference, and so the formula doesn't change, and I would copy just salesman C to the next row. So this is a little bit problematic if you have kind of very repetitive structure where you want to be able to copy down an entire column. So in order to kind of handle this, I'd actually have to come in and find salesman G and type times the bonus rate. Okay, so to get around this, we can use what is called naming a range of cells values. So now, as I said, let's talk about how do you name a range. So here, to name a range, first you select the range that you want to name, okay? And then you go to the input box and you name the range. And so here I'm going to choose to call this range sales. And then I press enter, and then I can do things like say equal sum sales. So let me go back to Excel and show you this. So now I'm going to select this range, and I'm going to say I would like to name this range sales, and I'm going to press enter. Okay, so now when I come to the bonus, I can say this is sales times the bonus rate. Okay, so what does Excel do? It says, okay, you've defined this range, but really I want you to, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the value in the range that corresponds to the same row level. Okay, so here we are. And so as I continue this, it picks out the value in that row and gives me, calculates the bonus using the value in the same respective row. If I try to use something, try to use the range and try to add $10,000 to it out here, what it's going to say is, I don't know what to do. I don't know, you are asking me to sum sales without aggregating it somehow, and then adding 10,000 to it. Because I don't know which one of these are, I'm just going to tell you that I don't know which value. Whereas if I were to say sales plus 10,000 here, it would know. It would say, okay, you mean the value of sales in the same row, which is 199, and if I add 10,000, it will be 235. Okay, so that's how we use the sales. Of course, you can always aggregate it by saying, hey, I want you to sum the values that are in that entire range, and now it'll say, okay, this is the sum of my sales. Let's continue here. Okay, so now let's talk about actually using the define name functionality so that we can change the scope. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the sales amount for salesman K, and I'm going to go to the formulas tab, and in the define name group, I'm going to pick define name. And when I do that, I'm going to get this menu, and I'm going to tell it that I want to define that name, but I don't want it to be visible to all the sheets in the workbook, but rather only to this particular worksheet. And so let me show you what happens. So I'm here, and I say, all right, I click on this cell, and I want to define names, okay? But I don't want it to be known in the entire workbook. I just want it to be known locally. So I'm going to say just in this worksheet and say okay. And so notice that here I can say, tell me what is the salesman K times the bonus rate, and I get the correct bonus. But if I come here and I try to type salesman K, I don't see it, right? It's not available. And if I try, it's going to give me an error. It's going to say, I don't know that name. It is not defined. Okay, but if I copy this formula and come back to this sheet and say, tell me, what is that? Well, salesman K is known in this worksheet, and so it gives me the value of the sales for the name manager. So watch what happens, okay? If I click on the name manager, it's going to show me all of the names that are defined within my worksheet. What happens if I decide to delete a name? It says, are you sure you want to delete bonus rate? And I say yes. And then when I say okay, all of my formulas that use that define name now have an error that says, I don't know that name, pound name question mark. Okay, so we have to be careful, and then we say, all right, this was a mistake. Let's go ahead and redefine bonus rate, and everything comes back. I now want to discuss how do you apply a name to a formula. So if you name a range after you've created a formula, it's not going to be automatically applied to the formula. Okay, so what I want to show you next is to how to apply the bonus rate name to the formulas in the worksheet that I had created previously that didn't use that name. So to do that, you have to go to the Formulas tab, and then you need to click on this little down arrow next to the define name and then select Apply Names. So let's go ahead and do that. So what I want to do here, notice that these formulas don't have any of the names from before. And so I'm going to go to the define name, and you have to click on this little side arrow and apply names. And here I'm just going to say, I know that these formulas only use the bonus rate, and so I'm going to say go ahead and apply that. And so now each of these formulas have the bonus rate. Okay. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is how to use names to navigate in a workbook. And so if you come to the name box and you click on this little arrow down here, it's going to show you a pull-down menu with all the names that we have defined in the worksheet. And so earlier when I was working on this, I named a cell, named area. And so when I select it, it brings me to this cell, which is the beginning of my named area. Okay, but it doesn't have to be just in the same worksheet. So I have in one of my sheets, I defined assumptions, and I called that cell background. And so when I select it, it takes me to a different sheet, to row 359. Okay, so it's a really nice way to get back to information and navigate very quickly without having to search for values. Okay, so now I want to summarize what we've done. So we want to use named cells and ranges because it makes navigation easier, just like I showed you before. It also allows us to make formulas much more intuitive, especially if we're showing them to a client or we have to explain them to someone that is now taking over our job. It's easier for them to understand the logic behind what we're doing. Sometimes for yourself, if you have names, it allows you to recall what you were trying to do in the worksheet. We'll spend quite a bit of time in the class talking about making spreadsheets robust, and also about spreadsheet errors. And one of the main ways that spreadsheet errors come into spreadsheets is when people are copying and pasting formulas across either multiple sheets or across a workbook or within a worksheet. And names allow us to kind of reduce the errors that are associated with copying and pasting. Of course, you can also get around that by using absolute and mixed cell references, which we'll discuss in class. In addition, named ranges or named values, they appear in autocomplete lists when we're using them when we're beginning to type a formula, so that makes it easier. And then you can add rows and columns without changing the formulas. So here we are. If we just add another column, we see that there's no difference, even though the position of the bonus rate has changed. Its reference is still the same here. Let me wrap up by also saying a couple things. When I define a name, and so let me show you, if I try to define a name that is already defined, Excel will give me this blank name. It's its way of telling you, hey, you've already have a name defined there. Okay, and so then I say, all right, cancel. If I try to define a name, and even if I go to the name box and I try to call this bonus rate, it's going to go back and it say that name is already defined and it's in this cell. Okay, so just a couple caveats for you to know. If you have a sheet that has a lot of names and you want to create a glossary of those names, you can come to this button here, which is the use in formula, and say paste names. And it's going to say, if you say paste list, it's going to give you a list of all the names and what their references are. Okay, so this is a nice way if you're embedding a glossary of names within your workbook or your report. Okay, so hopefully you found this helpful, and we'll make use of this with examples and things that we're going to be doing in class.